Shalom and welcome to the Middle East Report. In this program today, we'll be discussing the shocking attack on Israel's ambassador to the United Kingdom, and we'll be asking, have our universities become intolerant towards Israel? Warm welcome to the programme, and today's special guest is all the way from North London, and she's a regular on the Middle East Report. Sharon Klaff, warm welcome to the programme.
Hi Simon, thank you very much for having me back again.
It's a pleasure. And Sharon, just share with us and our viewers as well a little bit of an update on some of the activities that you've been doing with Campaign for Truth.
Okay, so of course COVID has interrupted everybody's lives. So we took this time to do a little bit of reflection and research and so on, and we've done a few meetings on Zoom, but very few because there are a lot of events taking place on Zoom and it's a little bit of a crowded field. So we've done a few, and we've got another one coming up on the 2nd of December with one of our favourite speakers, Richard Landis, who's going to be speaking on the background to what's happened in London this last few weeks. So that's what we've been doing. We've also come across more anti-Semitism and trying to work out how this anti-Semitism has changed, the driving force behind it in recent years. So that's where we've been this year.
Excellent. So pleased that you can join us. But what did you make on the awful harassment and the potential attack on Israel's ambassador to the United Kingdom, Zippy Hotevely, where she was speaking at the London School of Economics in front of 50 students plus 100 online, and then to get the abuse that she's got, considering that she is Israel's representative to the United Kingdom, considering that Britain and Israel are close allies and close friends. What are your thoughts on that disgusting abuse that she received actually on the 83rd anniversary of Kristallnacht?
Yeah, I'm not surprised. I know there are many people who are, particularly people who haven't been following these events over the last, probably since the middle of the early 2000s, 2005, 2006. I'm not surprised. It's not the first time it's happened. But the reason it's made such a story, well, there are two reasons. The one reason is that the mainstream media have decided to write about it. And the reason they're writing about it is because this ambassador has come here under not a cloud, but come here as a kind of different ambassador. She's very clear about her views. She's part of the Likud government. And as such, she got a lot of criticism when she came here, not only from people outside of the Jewish community, but from people within the Jewish community. And I understand that even the Board of Deputies didn't support her appointment. So she came here under a controversial umbrella. And so it's hit the press, but I've been doing these protests or countering these protests on campus for a long time. And I've known that Mark Regev, the previous ambassador, was subjected to very similar attacks at SOAS. We were there, we watched it. We tried to keep a cordon of people from actually going into the hall. So no, I'm not surprised, but it's very disturbing.
I want to say that she's a great ambassador. She's very warm, she's very friendly, she's very articulate, and I think she's been one of Israel's best ambassadors that I particularly work with or have known. So it's a pleasure to have her appointed to the court of St. James. But if we look at what's going on, so she organised the Israeli embassy together with I think it's the Debating Society at the London School of Economics, invited her to speak at LSE, in which she's talking to the next generation of future leaders. The event was titled Israel's Perspective, A New Era in the Middle East. But why do you think that the ambassador was allowed to be harassed like she was? And if it wasn't for her security guards, if it wasn't for her personal protection, and also the police, we could have had a major diplomatic incident on our hands, could we not?
It's potentially a very dangerous situation. Let me first say that I'm a great supporter of this ambassador. My view of Israel is very much in line with hers. And I'm pleased that she's here because she brings information that otherwise wouldn't arrive. So yes, I really do support her. It could have got out of hand. Luckily, Israel always has security, all their personnel, and particularly since 1982, when the then ambassador was shot and left paralyzed. I don't know if you remember that incident.
I don't remember. I know of it. That was actually inside the Israeli embassy,
yeah,
wasn't it?
Shlomo Argov. Yeah, and before that, the security wasn't that hot. But since then, there's been great security. So, yes, so she would have known that she was protected. But I came across social media posts that were horrific, that you would have thought that Twitter and Instagram would have taken them down, but they don't. Despite all this talk about working against hatred online, they don't take it down. So all of that was around. They had advertised that they had a great big horde of people there, pro-Palestinian people. And I wasn't surprised that it happened, but that she kept safe was expected, yeah.
But can you go some way in talking and maybe explaining to our viewers why there is so much hatred on campus towards Israel, and of course the Jewish people and Jewish students attending the universities finding it very difficult. My university, the University of Manchester, had in the 90s when I attended the biggest Hillel in the whole of the country, and now very few Jewish students actually attend the University of Manchester because they fear that they could be attacked.
Yeah, Manchester's changed. I've got a grandson who's just gone there. He seems very happy there, but it has changed. My son was there as well. Why are the universities hotbeds of anti-Semitism? I think there's always been an element of anti-Semitism, but when we had the ability to have free and open discussions on campuses, people could talk about it, people could learn, they could interact, they could learn who people are, how they are, what they think, what the history is, and that doesn't exist anymore. There's a shutdown. You know that there's cancel culture, there's a whole woke culture taking place, and free discussion on university campuses no longer exists. So I think it's got a lot to do with that. Why is anti-Semitism there? Universities are traditionally left-leaning, and we know over the last 5 years that the left have been prime in anti-Semitism. So I'm not surprised that it's rife there. I think also for quite a long time the students, Jewish students, weren't really active. In the last couple of years I think they've become active, they've realized that they have to have a voice. And I think also the Israeli government have become aware of BDS, and they've had a program via their embassies to go into universities to try and bring some information to students, if they're allowed to listen, because they don't come to the meetings. It's talking to the converted, because the students who come to the meetings are the Jewish students. The rest of them are outside attacking the speaker.
No, absolutely. So let's have a look at an interview that I did earlier with Israel's ambassador to the United Kingdom. We're now joined on the Middle East Report by Israel's ambassador to the United Kingdom, Zippy Hotevely. Can you share with us what happened to you at the London School of Economics when you were giving a talk about Israel and the new realities of the Middle East?
Yes, of course. Well, I was invited by the London School of Economics students, and I was giving an hour-and-a-half lecture together with the students, wonderful questions about Israel. And I must say that the event was excellent because the students were very curious and they wanted to know and they wanted to listen. But unfortunately, some people, the people that were protesting in the most violent way outside, didn't want the voice of Israel to resound. And they wanted to silence me. And they were trying to use aggression and to threat with this bully behavior in order to make sure I won't attend campus. And I think my message after the event was very clear. We won't be silenced. Israel's voice will be sound everywhere. And it's important that important ally and a friend of the UK will deliver, those kind of dialogues all over the country, because this is our job as diplomats, is to meet different people, meet students, definitely go to the very, very important British campuses and to have dialogue. And the absurd is, in my opinion, that it happens in university. It means that this is a place where freedom of speech should be maybe the first principle, and exchanging views should be the first value. Of course, the leadership of LSE were excellent. They gave the platform. They were encouraging the students to ask me questions. It was really not, the LSE institution that is a problem. The problem is the kind of, I would say, very, very violent way to try to make sure that a legitimate voice won't be sound. And I think this was the reason why the British government was showing its support in such a clear voice. We heard the Foreign Secretary, and we heard the Education Secretary and Health Secretary and Home Secretary that even, called me on a personal level. And she said how shameful it was to see this brutality towards, ambassador, towards a diplomat of a friendly country, of a democratic country. So I think the message of the British government was really important. And the truth is, and I would like to thank also your friends and your community that prayed for the safety of all of us in Israel. I really think that this is the majority of the British people, the people that care and love and support Israel. And actually those voices and those sounds that we heard at that night are not representing the majority. And it's important to remember that.
Absolutely. And can I just say on behalf of our viewers, we're so pleased you're okay, that nothing happened to you. But can I ask you this question? Is this a warning from history because it occurred on the same night, on the 83rd anniversary of Kristallnacht, as we saw the terror that reigned through Nazi Germany in November the 9th, 1938?
I never like comparing to those dark days, because thank God we live in a democracy. And Israel exists, what
Absolutely.
The German Jews didn't have as an opportunity. And of course, the British government is very supportive and fights in a very clear way anti-Semitism and all its expressions. And when they need to take action, like some things need to be investigated and some things are criminal, I'm definitely sure that the police, and together with the spirit that the government gives about no tolerance to anti-Semitism, is strong. But there is something we do need to learn from history, that we cannot accept brutality and violence against Jews and against the representative of the Jewish state.
And finally, Ambassador, how important is it that our universities across this country allow academic freedom of expression and also freedom of speech? Because it's so important that our university students actually get to hear the voice of Israel's ambassador and Israeli voices.
Well, I think it's very important, because the only way to really understand things and really to address certain criticism is by having a dialogue. So even if some people want to ask difficult questions or challenging issues about the conflict, about things that are going on in our region, I'm there to give them answers. I'm there to speak, to hear. This is the only way, to actually get the information from firsthand from Israeli. And I think I'm for freedom of speech for everyone. And I think that you can't really shape your opinions around issue if you're silencing certain voices and you don't get the diversity of voices around a certain issue. But I'm even more ashamed from the idea that any ambassador that would have come to campus, no matter which country he represents, even if it's not a democratic country, wouldn't have get such a reception. And this is something strange, why the only ambassador in this country and in general on campus, even around the world, it needs to have such a strong protection from people that want to hurt him physically, is really the Israeli ambassador. This is something that makes me be really concerned. And I really hope that the messages we received from the British government, together with the public support, I really felt like people were sending a very, very nice messaging after that. and we're showing support, I really think that this is the way to go, to make sure that the violence and the bullying won't be the mainstream way to treat Israeli ambassadors, but actually we will continue to come, to speak, to have a dialogue, because this is the only way to go.
Ambassador Zippy, thank you so much for joining us. You
Pleasure.
always have our love and support, and you're doing a fantastic job as an ambassador. And it's a pleasure.
I feel among friends, and thank you so much for your support to Israel, which is incredible.
Thank you. And that was Zippy Hotevely. We need to really keep her in our prayers, because she's a very special woman, and we're very blessed to have her, former Deputy Foreign Minister, as Israel's ambassador to the United Kingdom. One thing I like about Zippy is her warmth, her courage, because straight after she was attacked at LSE, she gave a number of different interviews, one to the Daily Mail and one to the Telegraph, and I had from the press department's done a very good job in setting those interviews up, and it gave her an opportunity to speak. But also we see that these dark forces essentially are trying to stop Israel from speaking, even though she was speaking about the new realities in the Middle East, how the likes that Israel has celebrated the first anniversary of the Abraham Accords, historic peace agreements with Bahrain, with the United Arab Emirates, with Sudan and with Morocco, and the Middle East is changing. And yet these bigots who have their viewpoints in the dark ages are not seeing the reality in the Middle East, that these once hostile Arab nations that wanted to destroy Israel are trying to seek peace with Israel.
I think the ambassador gave a fantastic message, and she brings a vibrancy to the embassy here and to this country from Israel that I've not seen, I don't think, ever before. She's young, she's youthful, she's very clever, she's very smart, she knows where she comes from, she knows the Middle East exceptionally well. So I'm very grateful that we have an ambassador like that, and I'm grateful that she puts herself out there trying to bring this message to a greater public. I'm hoping that she'll keep up the pressure on the government, because we've heard the government before talking about anti-Semitism, talking about anti-Israelism, and saying they need to do something, and they never really get round to doing it. So I'm hoping she's going to keep that pressure up and keep in touch with her colleagues and make sure that they keep hearing the message that this is no longer acceptable. With regard to the new reality in the Middle East, of course, these voices don't want to hear it. It's a possibility of finally finding some sort of equilibrium in the Middle East, and they don't want to hear this. They don't want to know that there will be an Israel forever, because they're there to destroy Israel. They're not there for any other reason than to say that the largest Jewish community in the world doesn't have a right to be in the place where Judaism was born.
And how do you think that the Jewish students attending LSE would have felt after the abuse against the ambassador and the potential attack, where they were actually encouraged to smash her windows? And there are even Instagram posts that went up by saying that if you smash the ambassador's car and you break her window, then we'll give you points.
Yep.
How must they be feeling?
I kind of know how they're feeling. I was on a campus in 2016 on University College campus when this went on. We were rushed from room to room to room with these hordes running behind us, not being stopped. They were, if you look at some of the videos, you'll see they were actually ushered into the university campus to follow us. And we finally were put in a room, and I think you showed in the beginning some of that, that protest. And during that time, there were some really beautiful young Jewish students who had organized this meeting for this Israeli speaker, Hen Mazik, who I think you may have met. And they broke down. I saw the tears, I saw the crying. They couldn't believe what they were being put through. I don't think, a lot of the children come from, more increasingly from Jewish schools where they're not exposed to this. And so I would imagine that they were feeling very hurt, they were feeling vulnerable. They've got to go back on campus the next day knowing that their faces were on the videos. So I think they will need a lot of counseling, a lot of care, and I'm pretty sure that the embassy is going to give them that. And I understand that they've been invited to government to have a talk. So I'm hoping again that they have the courage to push the government to say this cannot go on campuses anymore, where Jews and where Israel is the only topic that's rife for attack. You don't get that against any other ethnicity, you don't get that against any other country. As the ambassador said, it doesn't matter where they come from. All people need to be welcome in a place of learning where you can share ideas, where you can discuss, where you can disagree. You don't have to agree with each other, but you have to be able to have a discourse where you can work out, why do I feel like that? Why are you against me? Why do I not like something? And then we can find a way forward. That's what universities are for.
No, absolutely. So I do think we have a video, Sharon, of that particular event. So this is what occurred in 2016 at King's College London, when an event for Israel was organised and then was hijacked by supporters of the Palestinians.
Our message is a message about peace and not coexistence. Their message is about hate. Of course, hate towards message gets people wound up. Other leaders in Europe in the history did the same thing.
Israel, in general, the people, everyone there needs to get over themselves and realize that we're in the 21st century. They do not need no Jewish majority state.
Sadly, that's the state of affairs that we see at many of our universities across the country, this intolerance towards Israel and the Jewish people, and for the sake of academic freedom of expression and freedom of speech, it's got to stop. Horrifying scenes. I would have actually hated to be caught up in that, and I know that you actually attended that event at London.
University College.
Yeah, University College London, thank you. And which is alarming, because why should Jewish students, why should Israeli lecturers, why should those who support Israel come under such horrific attacks? And of course, what we also heard in that video as well, that Palestine will be free from the river to the sea. I mean, surely that's incitement to genocide, and the police should actually arrest some of the perpetrators behind them, because that is incitement to genocide. Because who is between the river and the sea? It's Israel, it's the Jewish people, and if you get rid of Israel, then effectively you're calling for genocide.
Absolutely. That's exactly what they're calling for. Where would the Jews go if they weren't living in Israel? Firstly, I was there, I was in the room, I wasn't with the crowd out there, I was actually inside the room, and while we were in the room, somehow a window got opened and 2-3 people rolled themselves into the window, into the room, and actually came inside. They came into the room that we were having the meeting in. And for me, I would have kept them there and made them listen to what we had to say so they can hear some information. But anyway, they were thrown out. At the end of that meeting, the Jewish group in the room were held under hostage, under siege. I think they were there for 2 hours. I refused to stay. I actually walked out. And when I walked out, that bunch were out there screaming and shouting like that. And the police that I saw were just standing and looking. They weren't trying to stop them. And this is something that we find a lot at all these demonstrations. There seems to be a fear to try and find a way to allow people to demonstrate, but not in that violent way. There's a fear even amongst the police. So I forget where you went from there.
I suppose the other question is, and this is the same with the attack on the ambassador and the heckling that she received back on November the 9th, 2021, only a couple of weeks ago, is that no one has been arrested for that.
No.
And I think that we are increasingly seeing these very hostile anti-Israel rallies, particularly after Israel's defensive war against Hamas in May. And we just saw that explosion of hatred on the streets of London directed against your community, the Jewish community, and against Israel. We see incitement towards genocide and nothing being done, no one being arrested. And it's only going to take criminal prosecutions to stop. So surely something has to be done, and the government has to say, look, you can no longer chant slogans of genocide. If the Nazis were doing it, or the far right, they would be arrested, it would be shut down. But because it's coming from Islamists or it's coming from the hard left, this seems to be okay. But it's not okay, is it?
This is why hopefully the ambassador is going to push her colleagues in government here in the UK to do something, because they don't arrest anybody. If you look at those videos, you can see the people who are there. It's not very difficult to identify them, and they don't go and arrest them. We saw in May of this year, there's a famous video of some of a policeman walking next to protesters who was screaming, "Where the Jews? We're hunting Jews, we need to find some Jews." And the policeman's walking next to them and he doesn't arrest them. We know that they drove through North London threatening to murder Jewish mothers, threatening to rape their daughters. And those 4 people that they finally arrested after some weeks, they're out on bail. Their trial has just been pushed ahead now into next year. So there seems to be there's a whole thing of critical social justice, but there seems to be no justice for crimes against Jews. There seems to be a lack of will to go out there and not only arrest people, but to stop people coming into the country who are going to propagate this. Now, we know, for instance, that the whole movement, the Palestinian movement, has got nothing to do with the Arab people who live in that area in the Middle East. It's got everything to do with the political progression to destroy Israel. And it's embraced not only within the BDS and the PSC here, the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, but it's embraced across the world with climate change. They were there with the Palestine flags in Glasgow at COP26. They were outside the White House when they were protesting President Trump 2016 on. So this Palestine issue is a central core that weaves its way through every protest, through every denial that takes place. And it's always against the Jews and it's always against Israel.
Well, it's an interesting article in the Daily Mail. This was Stephen Glover writing the Daily Mail, and this is what he wrote. He says, "Now we inhabit a new age of intolerance in which academics and students are terrified of challenging the new political orthodoxies for fear of being called to be deplatformed if they do so." So aren't we in real danger of endangering academic freedom of expression and freedom of speech at our universities, when our universities should be areas where people can explore different ideas, they can look at different viewpoints of the world and then come to their own conclusions, because it's those formative years where people make up their minds on key issues that they face.
Absolutely. There's an element of cancel culture across academia in the West, not just in this country. It's rife in America as well. But it's not new. And I think it's something that people miss. There's a focus now on the lady called Kathleen Stock, who was forced out of Sussex University for issues involving trans people. she has been speaking quite a lot about it and is quite offended that she wasn't allowed her free speech, that she was bullied, and that shouldn't have happened. She's a lecturer, by all accounts, a very accomplished lecturer, and she's there to teach the students, and the students should be there to listen, to debate, to bring information to her, and to have discussions, and this didn't happen. So there's a whole grievance about how she was pushed out of university. However, if we go back maybe to the early 2000s, this was happening to Jews on campus. These boycotts, these protests about Jewish speakers, Jewish lecturers and so on, this happened to the Jews before it's coming to the wider community. And people now being cancelled in universities remained in the universities. I don't recall hearing their voice when it was happening to Jews. And now suddenly it's broken out to this whole critical race theory, critical social justice theory, where there is no debate, where history's been cancelled, where they're pulling down anything that might have been tinged with slavery or something they disapprove of. But I didn't hear those voices when it started happening to Jews. And we get to that expression where it says when it starts with the Jews, it doesn't end with the Jews. And I think we're at that time now. We're at that time where it's moved from the Jews into broader society, broader Western culture, Western civilization. And I think we're in a very, very dangerous time.
But how much of this is to do with the funding of our universities from Middle Eastern states who are incredibly hostile to Israel, receiving huge grants to teach a certain viewpoint, an academic viewpoint, or to interpret history and politics in a certain political perspective? And how much is this also down to lecturers who hold very anti-Semitic and anti-Israel views? I mean, why is it that the Jewish state is the only nation whose very legitimacy and sovereignty is questioned in academic circles? We don't question South Sudan's right to exist, which is a very new nation. We don't question the artificial Middle Eastern states that were created after the Second World War. We don't question some of the African states that we created. We don't even question Australia or the United States as a legitimate question. But when it comes to the Jewish state of Israel, academics like to argue that she has no right to exist, which again is not what academia is about, because it's based on facts, and Israel has more international legitimacy through international law than the vast majority of modern states that are in existence today.
Well, a lot of questions there. Funding is always a problem, because with funding comes influence. So when you take money from somebody, that somebody expects you to hear what they want you to do. So there's a great difficulty in creating a balance about how you take the money, under what circumstances you take it, what negotiations you have, what you're going to do with it, etc., etc. So I understand that's an age-old problem, and I can't answer that. I have no clue how you're going to fund education if there aren't endowments. But how do you use those endowments and not allow any sort of influence of, it could be good or bad influence, but that influence to come into education. Even governments might put their slant on schools and universities when they're in power. So that's up to, I think it's up to academics to be able to be impartial when they're teaching, to know their subject, to know their topic, and to teach their students how to learn, how to look for information, regardless of where the funding's coming from. And that's very altruistic. I'm not sure that that can actually ever work. So why Israel? If I could answer that, I'd solve the problem.
Yeah, well, no, it's a much deeper. But what is the connection between cancel culture and cancelling Israeli lecturers, cancelling university students that stand up for Israel, not giving a platform to Israel, and the wider BDS movement known as the boycott, divestments and sanctions?
I think it's also a very big subject. It's got to do with globalization. It's got to do with this battle between the nation state and either the caliphate or universalism. So it's quite a big topic to get through. Why cancel culture this is another COVID eruption, that in the middle of COVID, sadly, there was that man in America, George Floyd, who was killed, and out of that came this whole BLM enterprise. And the BLM enterprise has elements of anti-Semitism in it and propagates anti-Semitism. It's an arena where Jews have been made white, so therefore Jews can no longer suffer any kind of race hate. It's a time we live in where even Jewish people are saying anti-Semitism and all other racism. So when a Jew is attacked, they diminish that attack by including other racisms that actually didn't happen in that context at that time. So it becomes, anti-Semitism becomes not a standalone racism, which it is. It becomes dissipated in a world where there is diversity and there are people who disagree or disapprove of other people, and that we have to work through that. But this strain of this illogical ancient hatred remains there. And as long as Israel is there, then the Jews are there, and then that hatred remains in the hearts of the people who are doing the hating, if that makes sense to you.
No, absolutely, absolutely. So let's have a look at this excellent CBN News report that asks the big question: what is the BDS, known as the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions?
BDS activists will tell you they're only defending the rights of Palestinians, but when they chant "from the river to the sea," they're calling for the complete destruction of Israel.
Our movement, the BDS movement, the Palestine Solidarity Movement, is finally starting to reframe the conversation, and that's why they're so afraid.
The BDS movement is growing and has become a force on more and more college campuses. It is aimed at only one nation, the only democracy in the Middle East.
No other country, just Israel.
Richard Millett tracks the BDS movement through his website.
They won't be calling for boycotts of America, who they don't agree with, or British government policy that they don't agree with, before we get into China, Russia, Syria, Saudi Arabia. There is no boycott, Dale. So you answer why.
The answer to that question can be found in the answer to another important question. Who founded the BDS movement? BDS leaders say the movement was launched in 2005 by the Palestinian Civil Society, but the evidence shows that is not true. Watch this video of BDS leaders discussing the origin of the movement at a conference in May of this year. Ilan Pape is director of the European Center for Palestinian Studies at the University of Exeter in England. He's considered a leading intellectual in the BDS movement. Here, Pape admits that the Palestinians did not create the BDS movement.
We're also active in it.
Well, the Palestinians launched the BDS in 2005 and 2004.
Yes, not really, but yes, okay. For historical records, yes. Okay.
That's important.
It's not true, but it's important.
It is important, because if the Palestinians did not begin the BDS movement, then the question, of course, is, who did? BDS expert Professor Gerald Steinberg in Jerusalem says BDS is a creation of European socialists and Muslim nations who oppose Israel, led by the 57-nation Organization of the Islamic Conference, the largest voting bloc at the United Nations.
So they get together with the radical left, started with the Soviet Union, certainly filters over to the Trotskyites and the Labour Party in the UK, and many other radical allies. And the fact that this is in many ways a European radical political movement makes it even less legitimate.
There have been boycotts of Israel since before the creation of the State of Israel. Some even trace the boycotts back to Nazi Germany in 1933. But the modern BDS movement took shape at the 2001 UN Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa, an event so rife with blatant anti-Semitism that the US and Israeli delegations walked out. Another key question is who funds BDS? Steinberg says the movement gets hundreds of millions of dollars a year. Some of its funding is difficult to track. But if you live in a Western nation, there's a good chance you help fund it through your tax dollars, and perhaps even your tithe. The BDS movement gets most of its funding from the European Union. European national governments, and even the US government, who give money to NGOs or non-governmental organizations that claim to fight for human rights, but who also oppose the State of Israel. Some Christian charities also give money to BDS. The webpage for Christian Aid makes it look like it only fights poverty. Drill down on their website and you'll find they also support BDS, as does the Presbyterian Church USA. And while the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement has been in one respect a failure, it has accomplished very little in the policy arena. It has succeeded in another area, by spreading anti-Semitism across college campuses. Ronnie Fraser, founding director of the Academic Friends of Israel, warns the next generation of leaders is being brainwashed, that Israel is the worst nation on earth.
Students are being fed a diet of Israel is a racist state, Israel is a Zionist state, Israel equals the Nazis.
We support the Intifada!
With massive funding behind it, BDS is turning people against Israel and creating a generation of leaders who may someday try to carry out what some have said is the real goal of the BDS movement: the elimination of the State of Israel.
Great report there by Dale Hurd, and we can all beat the BDS either by visiting Israel, and I know that Israel has just recently opened the borders again after COVID-19. We can buy Israeli goods and we can support the Jewish community and also support the Embassy of Israel by letting them know how much we love them, how much we cherish them, and how they're not alone. In this battle that we're fighting against the BDS, in defending freedom of speech and freedom of expression, in defending your Jewish community and also Jewish students, it's also important that Christians speak up, isn't it, against these things and add their voices to that of the Jewish community, because what's at stake is our Judeo-Christian heritage.
Absolutely. Our Judeo-Christian heritage is really being attacked, and a lot of them, you can see there from the videos, a lot of them attacking it are people who come out of the Judeo-Christian heritage. And when I was looking at that video, and I've been in many of those demos, I know those people, I recognize their faces, I have to keep asking myself, what makes a guy wake up in the morning, take a symbol of terrorism, put it around his neck, and go out and protest about hatred for another people, about something that doesn't affect his daily life? He goes home, he doesn't think about that when he's at home, he goes on and he's with his family and he goes out at clubbing and whatever he does, and yet he'll go on the streets and put himself on the line for a cause that really has nothing to do with him. It's not his deal, except that his life will be destroyed if the Judeo-Christian heritage is destroyed. And so we need to work together, we need to be together on that. We need to make sure that we can stop this whole idea of cancel culture, where people can't interact and share ideas and meet and share who they are with each other, so that they can go forward and build a world that we want to bring our children up in, instead of propagating this idea of hatred, of supporting terrorism, of supporting an organization like the Palestine Solidarity Campaign that lies underneath all of this. If there's one thing that the ambassador can do while she's here with her friends in government, and that's bring to them that the Palestine Solidarity Campaign needs to be proscribed. It needs to be stopped in its tracks from propagating this hatred. If you look at those protests, their banners, their flyers, there are all sorts of stuff that costs huge amounts of money, and that is coming from that umbrella of the PSC, obviously via European governments and so on. If you go to a protest, you come out of the tube, there are rows and rows and rows of banners and flyers and all sorts of stuff. You just pick it up and you hold your banner and off you go. When we go to counter them, we have to sit at the dead of night and we have to do our own drawings and virtually make our handmade posters that we can give out.
Yeah, but they're very good though, aren't they?
You know, they're pretty good, but we still have to do that, you know. So the government really has to understand what the root cause is, particularly in this country, where this all emanates from. It might be funded from Europe, but the PSC is here, the BDS is here. This is where, after Durban, this is where the BDS grew its roots.
But isn't this a lot of hypocrisy? I mean, we see the signs that Gaza free, end the occupation of Gaza. I'd like to see the end of the occupation of Gaza.
So would I.
Free of Hamas. And don't they realise that they are actually defending a genocidal terrorist organisation that suppress their own people, that murder Christians, that bring nothing but terror upon the entire population in Gaza? And then if we take, for example, the Palestinian Authority, are doing more to suppress the rights of its citizens, namely Palestinian citizens. We're seeing that anyone who criticises the PA on social media ends up being arrested, being detained, being tortured, or being killed. And if they really did care about the plight of the Palestinians, why do they never speak up about the sufferings of the Palestinians in Lebanon or in Syria, which many of their refugee camps have been bombed by Assad's regime, or in Jordan, where they're all second or third class citizens, and even the Palestinian community in Iraq faces genocide? This is not at the hands of Israel. This is at the hands of their other fellow Arabs, and yet they're silent because they don't really, really care about the Palestinians' cause. And when we look at the Palestinians today, all their infrastructure is being built by Israel. Their schools, their hospitals, their roads, their electricity plants, their water supplies, all of these are given by the state of Israel. And the Israeli government pay millions and millions of shekels into the economy of the Palestinian Authority, giving them jobs, allowing them to come into Israel, to work in Israel, where they receive wages that are 10 times higher than those within the Palestinian Authority. So the question is ignorance, isn't it? One of ignorance and one of not really understanding the cause in which they're fighting for.
It's a difficult one, because you've got the people who have the idea that they don't want an Israel, and they know what they're doing. And then they've got all their little foot soldiers who don't need to know what they're doing. They just need to carry the banners. They're given a few slogans. And you see it in the demos. If you engage with any of the foot soldiers and they come to talk to you, the minders come along and take them away, because they know that you can convince some of those foot soldiers that they've been indoctrinated, that this is not a cause they should belong to. So it just takes a few people to have evil intent, to be able to harness around them groups of people that will support them. We see from what happens to the Arabs in the West Bank and the Gazans, who are basically Egyptians, they're not really from that area. We see how they're treated by their own people, and yet the protesters don't say anything about it, because they don't really care about the people. They care about destroying Israel.
And that's the major problem, isn't it, when we look at these things, that the ordinary supporters of the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign, and if you're watching this programme, take a look at the Palestinian media, look at its education system, look at its incitement and incitement to violence and terrorism directed against Israel and the Jewish people, and really ask the very important question you need to ask yourselves is this something that you really want to support? I suppose it also is that mix, isn't it, between the hard left with the Marxist ideology that has had a big imprint in the Arab world, certainly from the 60s onwards, but also this Islamist thread as well that wants Israel's total destruction. And we've seen this very much in the views represented by Jeremy Corbyn and his followers.
Yes. Very much so. Well, if you look at BDS, if you go and Google BDS, you won't find BDS as a website. What you will find is PSC. It will take you directly there to the PSC, and we know that Jeremy Corbyn remains a patron of the PSC. We know he's been in, well, you know his history and his talks. You saw Richard Millett there. Richard's got all the recordings of Jeremy Corbyn's antics about anti-Israel and so on. So again, it's got nothing to do with the people. If you know, Simon, you go to Israel, you know that the ordinary citizen from the West Bank actually wants to lead a decent life. He works hard. He's lucky to have a border with Israel where he can come in and get some work, because very often there's no work for them. I know a few of these people because my family live right on the Green Line. So and they interact with them, they're friendly with them. And I know, for instance, the engineers, the university-trained people who can't get jobs because there are no jobs in Jordan, there are no jobs on the West Bank, and they can only come into Israel. And so if we could just get journalists to follow that interaction and promote that instead of all the sort of hot points like going to Hebron and saying, look what the Jews did here and look what the Arabs did there, but actually see how people interact. And I know they interact because my family interacts with them. And there's no reason why we can't do that. But if we've got this hatred, it blocks it. They don't want there to be peace in the Middle East because Palestine will be free from the river to the sea.
And also they lose out on money because it's a huge money-making enterprise which keeps the conflict alive. But we're seeing that through the Abraham Accords that this actually could be falling apart, which is good. We're down to the last 4 minutes of the programme, Sharon. So in terms of our viewers watching, and we've seen the horrendous treatment of Israel's ambassador at LSE, your treatment at King's College London, and others who support Israel, the plight of Jewish students who are suffering Jew hatred on campus, and hatred of Israel on campus has certainly got worse than when I was at university in the 90s, is an alarming wake-up call, I think, to the nation and to the West to know that if academic freedom of expression is now in peril, if freedom of speech is in peril, then we're heading into a new, dark, dystopian world where the democratic freedoms that we've enjoyed for centuries are now increasingly under threat. How do we respond to that challenge?
Well, I think we need to encourage our government to carry on getting rid of critical race theory in our schools. And they made a very big statement about it. They don't approve of it. And they need to stop it happening. It has to go. We need to make sure that our schools don't allow children to stand on desks and demonstrate for the Palestinian cause, as happened in the summer. So we need to stand together as a Jewish community and a Christian community. And you know that I work with some of the Christian groups. We need to stand together, and if we work together, because of the numbers and our will and our belief in our Judeo-Christian heritage, I think that we can win through on that.
Yeah, because it's so important, because once we lose academia, that's where all the ideas are made, that's where the ideas are created. Then we're in real trouble. But it starts with the Jewish people first, as you mentioned earlier, and the late Dr. Robert Wittstrich mentioned this very well when he was the world's leading expert on Jew hatred, said that what starts with the Jews never finishes with the Jews. So what happens to the Jewish people effectively target the rest of society, get engulfed by the same situation, which we know ultimately bring about the collapse of Western civilization. So it's important that our government and everyone be vigilant and to fight Jew hatred where they see it, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I think that's right, that if we are to stop it, we have to work together. We have to make sure that forces of evil can't win through, which I don't believe they will do, but they can't win through. We have to look after everybody, not just pockets of people. And what we can't do is cure one racism with another racism. We have to make sure that racism has no place, that debate is free, that there's freedom of expression. Obviously freedom comes with responsibility, but that people do have the freedom to have exchanges, that lecturers can teach without being frightened that if they teach the truth, they might lose their jobs. So this is where government has to come in. They have to step in. And this is where we as a community can hopefully work together and help the government to do that.
Yeah, and we've also seen that our Education Secretary, Nadim Zawi, has also rightly condemned the attack on the ambassador at LSE. He's even said that Jewish students attending LSE can come and have a meet with him to discuss what they can do to combat anti-Semitism. So, Sharon, thank you so much for being my guest on today's Middle East Report. Always a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I want to thank you for watching today's programme. We can't tolerate hatred being directed against the Jewish people at our universities or college campuses. We can't allow Israeli speakers, including the Israeli ambassador, from being deplatformed from speaking at our universities, because if we do, then our whole democratic system and our way of life is under threat. That's why it's imperative that we stand up for Israel and the Jewish people, and we also support the ambassador in our prayers. And I also encourage Israel as well to be forthright in explaining Israel's righteous position in the Middle East. So thank you for watching today's Middle East Report.